The new Argentinian thriller on Netflix, The Wrath of God, just arrived on the platform. It's got a fairly dark premise, but is it worth checking out? A young woman immersed in a circle of mysterious deaths of relatives has a growing suspicion that the person responsible is her enigmatic writer former boss. We follow Luciana, who's a teenager when we meet her, and then she's working as a transcriptionist for a couple of authors. When one of them, named Kloster, kisses her, she then quits and brings a suit against him for sexual harassment. Now, after the writer experiences a tragedy, Luciana experiences some very suspicious deaths in her family, leading her to believe that Kloster is killing them off. This is a very brooding tone to it. The beginning of the film opens in the present with something pretty dramatic, and then it goes back in time to show us all of the events that led up to that beginning point. But with this opening scene, we don't see all that happens, which then creates this giant air of mystery that becomes the backbone for the rest of the intrigue. We see a series of tragedies occur within the story, and each of them containing a bunch of circumstantial elements that are meant to lead our thinking down a certain path. I think it's pretty effective in doing this, especially because the clues that we see, which influence our ideas, they're not incredibly overt, but rather they're small visuals or maybe lines of dialogue here and there that could be easy to miss, but are apparent within the context of the sequences. The premise of the story was very interesting to me because of the way the characters are set up. Now, we have a famous author being pitted against an unknown average citizen. Luciana truly believes that Kloster is responsible for the deaths that are happening around her. But for her to say it, she comes across as delusional or maybe paranoid. It's kind of a David and Goliath case, or maybe even a look at the Me Too movement without being preachy or blatant. In this case, there's no clear-cut evidence that establishes her claim. We just have a woman who believes that something is happening and believes that she knows the culprit. Now, the rest of the world sees Kloster as this phenom, a gifted writer and jewel to society. This could be crazy-making for Luciana, which we see her start to unravel in her desperation and mental anguish. At one point, another writer turned journalist is asked to take a look at the deaths, and we then get a bit more of a detective story once this happens. Uncomfortable interviews happen, leads are chased, each of them working to bring even more questions for us as the audience. I think there was a big opportunity to dive more into the detective story, though. Raising questions is fine, but working out the details and then giving us enough information to solve the puzzles on our own, that would have been fun. We don't really get to do that, though. There are small bits of info that we get, allowing us to make some educated guesses, but I never really felt like there was this aha moment where we just stumble upon proof either one way or the other. That's not necessarily a bad thing, though. But that being said, there is a resolution that comes at the end, so we're not left hanging with uncertainties. The settings are great at reinforcing the brooding and melancholy tone that permeates this story. Many times it's overcast or maybe raining, with gray clouds removing a lot of the sun's light to create this feeling of cold and dread. Diego Peretti, who plays Kloster, is just wonderful at establishing an ambiguously menacing character. He's a thinker, someone with deep intellect, but also with a tremendous amount of grief that he's carrying around. And this shapes his body and his facial features, giving off just this whole "don't F with me" vibe. Luciana is played by Macarena Achaga, and while she's not ambiguous in her emotional output, she's also beaten down by grief and sadness. She's like this tortured soul wandering the earth, just barely holding on to her last little bits of hope. But she's also reaching her breaking point. Is her grief clouding her judgment? Is it making her believe those tragic coincidences are really nefarious works of revenge? I love that it's not cut and dry, that this story creates just the right amount of doubt and then holds it very close to the chest until the final climax where we get the resolution. Juan Menuhin plays the reporter Ray. Now, he's also someone who's damaged and flawed and carrying around a ton of baggage. And the way his story interacts with both Kloster and Luciana is wonderful because it brings more doubt into the picture of who's telling the truth, and then is there anything beyond some of the unfortunate events? Now, this is 97 minutes long, and for a small part of this, I did feel the time. But I was still wanting to find out what the truth was, so that helped me not to mind too much. Now, as much as I really enjoyed the mystery part of this, most of it felt like the story was only circling just a lot of the elements, like it didn't want to dive too heavily into each of the arcs that built the larger narrative. It's kind of a weird feeling because I semi-like this for the most part, but I also have this nagging feeling like portions were just incomplete, or maybe they were underdeveloped. But when it's all put together, the story makes sense and it has a cohesive resolution. And maybe that's what it is, that despite all of the pieces fitting together, along the way, it was lacking the depth that I craved. And just because the movie offers us a resolution at the end, that doesn't mean I have to like it either. I think the tone of the end fits with the rest of the film, but it's not what I was looking for in an ending. The ending is almost nihilistic, which could be a major disappointment for you. So overall, The Wrath of God delivers a melancholy and dark tone to its mysterious drama. The acting is good at maintaining the dour demeanor, which is then reinforced by the settings and the environments. I enjoyed the doubt that is continuously raised within the story, but was left with the feeling that the elements were underdeveloped and then not fully explored. Now, I appreciate that the end doesn't leave us hanging and provides some answers. I just didn't like the answers that it gave. There's no sex, some very brief nudity, a lot of profanity, and then some very brutal violence. I give The Wrath of God 2.5 out of 5 couches. So what are you binging right now? Let me know what's at the top of your watch list in the comments below. If you enjoyed this review, please give it a like. Also, don't forget to share and subscribe. I'm Chris. This is Movies and Munchies. Thanks for couching with me.